Marco moved into his dead father's shed because it was the only roof he had left. Nobody invited him to stay there, but the concrete foundation was solid, and the metal roof usually kept the rain off his head. After the funeral ended, his half-siblings moved right into the main house, claiming the brick walls, the warm heaters, and the granite kitchen counters for themselves. Marco walked away with nothing but an old shovel and a key to a workspace that smelled like rust and gasoline. His family told him he could stay on the property as long as he kept his mouth shut and stayed out of sight. They wanted him to be a ghost in the backyard while they enjoyed the inheritance. One afternoon, Marco was working near the old garden steps that led to a patch of weeds when his shovel hit something hard. It wasn't the dull thud of a rock or the snap of a tree root, but the sharp ring of metal against metal. He knelt in the dirt and cleared the earth away with his bare hands until he saw the dull glow of copper piping. This wasn't scrap metal buried by mistake, because the pipes were professional grade and laid with a precision you only see in high-end construction. He didn't realize it yet, but that single swing of the shovel had just cracked open a secret his father buried decades ago. The dirt he was moving was about to reveal the truth about who actually owned this land and exactly why he had been left behind. The mornings were the hardest part of living in a shed that wasn't built for people. Marco would wake up to find frost crawling across the inside of the windows, and his breath would hang in the air like smoke while he fumbled for the old coffee maker. He spent his early hours boiling water on a cheap hot plate and drinking instant coffee that tasted like wet cardboard, waiting for the sun to warm the concrete floor enough so he could move his frozen fingers. While he shivered in the shed, his half-siblings from his father's second marriage were living comfortably in the big house. Sarah spent her days managing a dental office, and David worked some kind of corporate job in tech consulting, though neither of them knew how to pick up a wrench. They treated the family estate like a private resort they'd earned, even though they hadn't spent a day of their lives maintaining it. The only reason they let Marco stay was because he was useful to have around when things started to break. If the gutters were overflowing or the fence started to sag, they called Marco, and he would crawl under their sinks at midnight to fix a leak without asking for a dime. He was the family handyman, tolerated only as long as he kept the house running and accepted their dinner leftovers as payment. One morning, Sarah walked out onto the porch while Marco was kneeling in the dirt to fix a loose railing. She stood over him with her arms crossed and a cold look in her eyes, reminding him that he couldn't live in the backyard forever. She called him a permanent guest and made sure he knew the house belonged to her and David now, not him. Marco didn't even look up at her because he was too busy focusing on the work in front of him. The shed had been his father's workshop for 30 years, and the walls were still lined with the hammers and levels of a man who knew how to build things that lasted. Marco had grown up at his father's side, learning how to read blueprints and how to spot a problem in the foundation before the rest of the house even felt it. The garden steps were falling apart and letting water pool against the house, so Marco decided to fix them before the rot reached the main structure. Nobody asked him to do it, but he knew that if he didn't create proper drainage, the whole place would eventually crumble from the bottom up. He started digging deep into the mud beneath the stone, clearing out the heavy, wet earth to make room for gravel. That was when the shovel blade struck the copper. He dropped to his knees and began pulling the soil away with his fingers, revealing a series of heavy pipes with perfectly soldered joints. This wasn't the work of an amateur or a mistake made during a quick repair, because these pipes had been hidden here with a very specific purpose in mind. Marco sat there in the dirt and stared at the metal, realizing his father had left a map in the ground for the only son who was actually listening. Marco didn't bother standing up. He just kept digging, his fingers working the dirt away from the metal until he could feel the true weight of the pipes. These weren't the cheap, thin lines you find at a bargain hardware store. Copper like this cost real money, and the installation looked like it had been handled by a master. Every joint was sealed tight and soldered smooth, showing the kind of care that doesn't come from someone just learning on the job. He traced one line with his palm and followed it deeper into the cool earth. The pipe didn't just wander. It descended at a very deliberate, engineered angle. This wasn't a random mistake his father had made and then buried out of embarrassment. Everything about the layout suggested a clear purpose. The piping eventually branched off into two directions. One line ran toward the main house foundation before disappearing into the dirt, while the second line headed toward the back boundary of the property. Marco sat back on his heels for a moment and just stared at the junction where they split. A valve system sat right there at the fork. It was corroded from years in the ground, but the multiple connections and manual shutoffs were still intact. This wasn't just a repair. This was infrastructure. This was a complete system. Marco was certain now that his father had built this with his own two hands. The workmanship matched everything he'd learned as a boy, back when he used to watch his father work on projects before the second marriage changed everything. That was before his father seemed to turn into someone else, a man who suddenly had no time for Marco and gave every waking hour to his new family and his new life. But this project was different. This was something his father had done with incredible care, and he had done it in total secret. Marco found some faded markings on the copper where the pipes joined together. There were technical notations and numbers that didn't mean much to him yet, but then he saw a date scratched into the metal. 1987. That was years before Marco was even born, meaning his father had installed this entire system decades ago. He worked through the heat of the afternoon, following the lines and clearing away the dirt until the full scope of what lay beneath the garden finally became clear. Even though the pipes were old, they were still in great shape. The copper had turned a dull green in a few spots, but there wasn't a single leak or any sign of the walls wearing through. His father had chosen the best materials, and they had lasted. That evening, Marco decided to bring it up during dinner. Sarah was sitting there eating a salad from a ceramic bowl, her eyes fixed on her plate rather than looking at him. "I found some old pipes under the garden steps today," he said, watching her closely. "It looks like a pretty extensive copper system, and I was wondering what they were for." Sarah's fork stopped midair. She looked up at him, and for a split second, her face didn't show curiosity or confusion. It showed pure fear. "Don't touch those," she said, her voice flat and final. "They are not your concern." She didn't ask if the pipes were broken or if they might be dangerous to have near the house. She didn't even ask what they looked like. She just shut the conversation down immediately, which told Marco everything he needed to know. She knew exactly what those pipes were, and she knew they were important. That night, Marco did the only thing he could. He sat in the shed with his laptop, a machine held together by duct tape and a prayer, and started searching for answers. He looked up buried copper systems and underground infrastructure, wondering why a man would hide this kind of engineering work from the world. Every search result pointed him in the same direction. He was looking at a geothermal system, the kind of setup that uses heat pumps to pull warmth directly from the ground.
It was sustainable energy, the sort of thing that requires specialized knowledge to install, but pays for itself over many years. Marco stopped typing as the realization hit him. He understood now why his father had gone to all this trouble, and he finally knew why his sister's voice had turned so cold when he mentioned it. His father hadn't just built a way to heat a house. He had built a future. It was a hidden legacy, one that Marco was clearly supposed to find. The way geothermal heat works is actually pretty simple. Once you get below the frost line, the ground stays at a steady temperature all year, usually around 55 or 60 degrees. You pump water down into that warmth so it can absorb the heat, then you bring it back up to a pump that concentrates that energy and sends it through the house. There is no furnace, no oil, and no massive utility bills, because the earth is doing all the heavy lifting. Marco understood the theory from his research, but seeing it on a screen was nothing like realizing what his father had actually accomplished. Those pipes had to lead somewhere specific. They couldn't just end in the dirt. They had to lead to a real heat source. That meant there was a spring or a pocket of groundwater nearby that stayed warm enough to keep the whole system running. The next morning, he spent his time following the second branch of piping toward the back of the property. He tracked it past the tree line and toward the boundary fence, noticing how the copper descended at a very specific pitch. His father had obviously known exactly what he was doing when he engineered every single angle of this trail. The path finally ended at a concrete pad about 6 feet across. It had been sealed smooth, but in the corner, someone had scratched some faded letters into the surface. J.M.
1987. Those were his father's initials, and that was the year he had finished this massive project. Marco knelt down and ran his hand over the rough concrete. His father had stood on this exact spot in 1987, likely after drilling down to find the warmth he knew was there. He had confirmed his discovery, sealed it up, and then covered it so no one would ever suspect a thing. There was a spring under that concrete. There had to be. It was a geothermal spring his father had discovered and built an entire system around, hiding it so well that the people living in the house didn't even know it was there. Later that night, Marco took a look at the electric bills Sarah had left sitting on the kitchen counter. For a house of this size, the cost to heat it through a cold winter should have been staggering. But the numbers on the paper were incredibly low, sitting at a few $100s when they really should have been in the thousands. His half-siblings had been living in total comfort their entire lives, and they owed every bit of it to a system his father had built in secret. They were staying warm because of a spring they didn't know existed, and because of work his father had finished decades before Marco was even born. The whole situation started to make sense as Marco sat there in that cold shed. His father must have known the inheritance would be split up unfairly, and that Marco would likely end up with nothing. To fix that, he built something that couldn't be divided or sold off easily. He created something that required the very land Marco was standing on, a gift that would only matter to someone who actually took the time to look. It was a reward for someone who cared enough to follow the pipes. Marco went back into his father's old workshop and began digging through the metal cabinets. Hidden under layers of old receipts and rusty brackets, he found a leather-covered notebook. The pages were filled with detailed sketches and measurements, all written in his father's familiar, careful handwriting. There were diagrams of the pipes, calculations for the water flow, and notes about the temperature readings from deep underground. He even found the specifications for the heat pump he hadn't located yet. His father had documented every single step of the process and left a perfect record behind. At the very back of the notebook, he found a single sentence written in his father's hand. For Marco, when he's ready to find it. Marco sat in the silence of the shed, holding that notebook close to his chest. He finally understood that he hadn't been forgotten or cast aside. He had been chosen. His father had put in all that time and effort for something that would only ever belong to the person willing to dig for the truth. He had been left a message written in copper and concrete, and he knew right then that it was about to change everything. 3 days later, Sarah called a family meeting that felt more like a confrontation. David drove in from the city, and they all sat around the kitchen table, the very one Marco had refinished years ago when nobody else bothered to care for it. Sarah didn't waste time with small talk, opening instead with a question that was really an accusation. What exactly have you been doing under the garden steps? Marco was ready for this moment because he had spent the last few days preparing his evidence just like his father taught him. He had copies of the notebook pages, clear photos of the hidden pipes, and printed search results explaining how geothermal systems actually work. He followed the old man's golden rule to document everything and let the evidence speak before drawing a single conclusion. Dad built a heating system, Marco said, sliding the papers across the wood. It's geothermal, and it has been running right under your feet for decades. David leaned back and shook his head, claiming that such a thing wasn't possible since they had never heard a word about it. Marco simply looked him in the eye and told him that he hadn't heard of it either, until he took the time to actually look. Sarah's jaw tightened as she realized what this meant for the property value. It's part of the estate, Marco, which means it belongs to us. Marco placed the notebook on the table, pointing to his father's cramped handwriting and the careful calculations that proved he had hidden this from the very people who thought they owned every inch of the land. He hid it on purpose, Marco said quietly, letting the weight of that truth sink in. He installed this system back in 1987 and documented every step, yet he sealed it up and never told a soul in this room. The kitchen went completely still, the kind of heavy silence that happens when people realize they've walked straight into a trap. Sarah's voice lost its casual edge, replaced by something much harder and more desperate, as she told him to stop looking into things that weren't his concern. He left a note in the notebook, Marco continued, ignoring her tone. It has his initials and the year, and it says, I don't want to hear what it says, Sarah snapped, cutting him off before he could finish. You aren't a beneficiary, so you have no claim to this house or anything buried on this property. David stayed quiet, but his hands were curled into tight fists on the table while he calculated the legal fallout of this discovery. He understood the value of what Marco had found, and he realized their father had deliberately kept them in the dark. Change the locks on the shed, Sarah told David, speaking as if Marco wasn't even sitting right in front of them. He can take his tools and his things, but he needs to leave today. David added that they would need to consult a lawyer, trying to make the threat sound official and legitimate. Marco felt a strange sense of clarity settle in his chest, because he realized their mockery had turned into genuine fear in a matter of minutes. They knew their father had left a secret for someone else to find, and they hated that they weren't the ones chosen to hold the key.
Sarah's voice cracked just a little as she accused him of trying to be clever.
You think you found something that makes you special, but you're just making problems where there don't need to be any.
Dad always liked you better, she finally admitted, the words coming out sharp and bitter like a long-held grudge.
That's why he spent his time on some stupid underground system, instead of leaving you money like a normal father, just so he could make you feel important. She had confirmed it without even realizing what she'd said. She admitted their father had made a choice to build something that would only ever matter to Marco. He didn't bother to argue, instead looking at the fear behind his sister's eyes and realizing his father's plan was even more brilliant than he first thought. His half-siblings weren't just dependent on a system they didn't own. They were now completely dependent on the brother they had tried to make invisible.
Marco knew he couldn't handle the next steps alone, so he went looking for the kind of help you have to pay for. He found a property attorney named Susan Chen, who ran a modest office above a downtown coffee shop, and he brought her everything he had found. He laid out the notebooks, the photos, and the technical specs while explaining exactly what his father had built and how his siblings were trying to shut him out. Susan didn't say a word until she had read every single page. She leaned back in her chair and explained that while the spring was a natural resource belonging to the estate, the engineering and labor his father put into the system created a different legal situation. If his father had documented his intent for Marco to manage it, the entire power dynamic of the inheritance shifted. She then pointed out the massive trap his siblings had walked into without even knowing it. The geothermal system had been humming along for decades without a single permit or any formal registration with the local utilities. This meant Sarah and David had been benefiting from an illegal energy source and extracting resources without any official authorization from the county. It might seem like a small technicality, Susan said, but if an inspector gets involved, they're going to ask a lot of expensive questions about who installed this and whether it meets the current building codes. Susan spent the rest of the afternoon making calls, and by the time the sun went down, she had a plan for Marco to fight back. He could file for a clarification of utility rights or ask the county to assess if the system was even legal to operate. By documenting his father's intentions, Marco had earned himself a seat at the table as an interested party who couldn't be easily ignored. Marco didn't actually want to destroy his family, but he did want them to understand that he had options and that his father had protected him. He sent a polite, clear letter through Susan's office, proposing a fair compromise where they would acknowledge his rights in exchange for keeping the county out of it. They didn't even bother to reply. Since they chose to ignore the olive branch, Marco moved forward and filed the official paperwork with the building department. 3 weeks later, a county inspector arrived at the front door looking for the unpermitted system that had suddenly appeared in their records. He found the pipes, the concrete pad, and the old heat pump that had been hidden in the basement for 30 years. The inspector didn't leave until he had issued a formal notice of violation that gave the heirs two very difficult choices. They could either spend a fortune formalizing the system with new permits and registrations, or they could shut the whole thing down immediately. Shutting it down would mean losing the very thing that kept the house warm and the utility bills low during the brutal winter months. Without that system, the property would become nearly unlivable and incredibly expensive to maintain. Yet keeping it meant admitting their father had planned this all along. They would have to acknowledge that the man they looked down on had built something of immense value and left it for the son they tried to throw away.
That evening, the phone rang, and Marco saw Sarah's name on the screen. Her voice wasn't angry or dismissive this time. She just sounded tired and defeated. "We need to talk," she said, "about what happens next." The meeting took place in Susan's office on a cold Thursday morning. Sarah arrived with David at her side, while Marco carried nothing but that old notebook. No lawyers had been called yet, but as they sat around the table, everyone in the room could feel that the power had shifted. Sarah opened the conversation by trying to buy him off. She offered $50,000 if he would just sign away any claim to the spring, the pipes, and the entire system. She acted as if Marco needed a quick check more than he needed a future, but he didn't even blink at the money. "I don't want your cash," Marco told them firmly. "I want the system." David leaned forward, his face tightening as he spoke. "That's not a reasonable request." "It is exactly what our father left for me," Marco replied. "He didn't put it in a formal will, but he wrote it in copper and concrete. He spent years of his life and a fortune of his own money building this with his own hands. He hid it away and left a note with my name on it. And that wasn't an accident. It was his intention." Marco didn't want their house, and he didn't want to see Sarah and David suffer, so he laid out a deal that gave him what was rightfully his. He demanded full ownership of the geothermal system and the spring access, along with a deed amendment for the land where the machinery operated. In exchange for the title, he would grant them a permanent right to use the heat so they could keep their comfort while he kept his security. Sarah's expression turned to stone. "That is not how these things work." "Actually," Susan said as she slid a legal document across the desk, "that is exactly how this works, and it is the only real option your clients have left. They can either sign this and share the system, or they can explain to the county why an unpermitted geothermal plant has been running on this property for 36 years. The room went completely silent as Sarah and David looked at each other. When you are forced to choose between two bad options, it isn't much of a choice at all, and everyone at that table knew it. "I am not trying to hurt you," Marco said, and the honesty in his voice was clear. "I'm just trying to survive, and Dad made sure I had the tools to do that, so I am taking what he left for me." 2 weeks later, the ink was dry on the papers, and Marco was finally a property owner. He wasn't just a man living in a shed anymore. He was a man with a deed, a piece of land, and infrastructure that held massive value. When fall arrived, Marco finally moved out of that shed and into the small house on his portion of the property. It was a modest place, but it had a real bedroom, a kitchen, and windows that didn't freeze over when the wind kicked up. By the time spring rolled around, he was planting tomatoes in his own soil. The geothermal system kept humming along, and while Sarah and David still got their heat, the dynamic had changed forever. They knew exactly what was under their feet now, and they knew Marco was the only one who could keep it running, which meant they could never pretend he was invisible again. Marco spent that first winter making the system even better, by installing new piping and improving the overall efficiency. He even started talking to the local utility company about the possibility of generating power. What his father built wasn't just heating a single house anymore, because it was growing into something that could provide for the whole community. Standing out by the spring one afternoon, Marco finally realized what his father had been doing all those years ago. It wasn't about revenge or some hidden punishment. It was about protection. His father saw a son who the world would try to treat as worthless, so he left him something that only he could find to prove his true worth. Those copper pipes weren't just pieces of metal buried in the dirt. They were a final message from a father to a son, telling him that he mattered and that he always would. Marco stood on his own land and watched the equipment hum in the biting cold air. The man they tried to hide away had become the very person they had to depend on to keep their lights on. What would you have done if you found a secret like this? Subscribe to see what happens when the truths we bury finally come back to change everything.